Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you the libertarian perspective on the burning issues of our time. Today, I have the good fortune of having as my co-host of the Libertarian Angle, George Leaf. George is the Director of Research at the John W. Pope Center for Higher Education Policy in Raleigh, North Carolina. He's a regular columnist of Forbes magazine, and it's a great pleasure to have you, George. Welcome to the show.
A pleasure to be on. Great pleasure. Finally, at long last, we're here.
Yeah. Well, you wrote a really nice, insightful article in the last day or so, maybe today. I just saw it on Forbes on the Kelo versus City of New London case, the whole concept of eminent domain. Of all the shows that we've done on the Libertarian Angle, I don't think we've ever done one on eminent domain. So I thought, well, this is a nice opportunity to address this issue. So why don't you open up the show a little bit and tell the audience a little bit about your article that you wrote for Forbes.
All right, glad to. Let's start by noting that it was just barely over 10 years ago that the Supreme Court issued its ruling in Kelo versus City of New London, an eminent domain case that was handled by the Institute for Justice. The basics of the case are fairly simple. The City of New London wanted to revitalize a part of the city that had fallen on hard times following the closure of a big U.S. Navy facility. And they came up with the idea of using eminent domain to construct a 90-acre project that would have a great big headquarters building for Pfizer Pharmaceuticals, would have shopping, and would have high-end residences. And the problem, of course, was that some of the people who owned homes in that area didn't feel like leaving. Therefore, they resorted to the threat of eminent domain. The New London Development Corporation told the people who wanted to remain in their homes that unless they consented to having them taken over and accept the low ball price the city was going to offer them, they would use eminent domain. Under that threat, quite a few of the homeowners said, well, we can't fight City Hall, so we may as well give in. But a number of them decided to fight it out, and they were fortunate enough that their case came to the attention of the merry band of libertarian litigators, as Chip Miller puts it, at the Institute for Justice. And the Institute for Justice attorney said, look, we think this is a case we want to fight. Eminent domain has had a pretty much clear sailing in the courts for a long time. The courts have deferred and said, well, if the officials think it's a good thing, then we'll just let them do it. And in this case, we had that the stars kind of aligned here because we had really sympathetic plaintiffs, older people who just wanted to keep their homes, and we had a rather evil-looking government entity that was using very nasty tactics against these people. In fact, much more than people really knew about. And that comes out in the book that I was writing about, Ilya Soman's book, The Grasping Hand, where he recounts some of the ugly tactics that were used to harass the people who simply wanted to remain in their own homes. So the case proceeds on through the courts. And in state court in Connecticut, the judge says, well, precedents are that we have to let the officials have their way, and therefore he approved the eminent domain taking. At the state Supreme Court, the same thing, although it was by 4-3, and there was a very strong dissent by one judge who said, yeah, it's true that precedent is that we let the local officials do what they think is good for the overall benefit of the community. But he said, there really should be much more heightened level of scrutiny in these cases. So we're not just automatically rubber stamping whatever local officials say is good. Well, then they appealed to the Supreme Court of the United States. And the prospects didn't look that good, actually, based on the Supreme Court's precedents. Going back to a 1954 case called Birdman versus Parker, the Supreme Court had pretty much used this lazy man's way of handling litigation, of saying, well, we should defer to the supposed wisdom and knowledge of the local officials. And Birdman versus Parker was a case where a man who owned a department store in Washington, D.C., had his land, along with land in the area, condemned under the grounds that it was supposedly blighted. And he said, well, that's ridiculous. My land is not blighted. This is a functioning department store. We're not out of business at all. We're doing business. We're not blighted. But the Supreme Court said, well, we have to defer to local officials, and so they let that condemnation take place. And then in 1984, there was a case in Hawaii where Hawaii politicians wanted to confiscate a whole lot of land, mostly just on egalitarian grounds. They said, well, some people own too much land, so we're going to break up their holdings and redistribute it. And in an opinion by Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, the Supreme Court said, oh, we must defer to the wisdom of the local officials. They know best. So given those precedents, it really didn't look very good for the plaintiffs in Kelo. But there were some differences. One of them was that the plaintiffs were much more sympathetic, and that matters in litigation. Here were elderly people, working class people who just wanted a chance to keep their own homes. And very big corporation and allied with local politicians and saying, we need this land. Furthermore, it didn't appear that the land of all these people was really even necessary for the project. When the plans were scrutinized, it turned out that a lot of this land was not really necessary. But, and this is really intriguing to me, and Selman brings this out in his book, the officials behind this had said, well, we just can't have this development surrounded by, quote, tenements, unquote. Well, these were tenements, even if they had been. There's nothing wrong with a tenement. These are older single-family homes, but they didn't want that. And the head of the redevelopment council called the homes ugly and dumb, as if her judgment about the aesthetics should trump other people's right to keep their property. Well, nevertheless, despite the fact that the precedents didn't look all that good, the Institute for Justice pressed ahead, and the Supreme Court granted cert on the case. Well, that set up a very interesting oral argument in late 2004. And the key moment in the case came when Sandra Day O'Connor asked the attorney for New London, well, what if someone owned a Motel 6 in town, and local officials said, we'd rather we had a Ritz-Carlton there paying more taxes. That would be a better use of the land. And she asked counsel for New London, would that be okay? And he unflinchingly said, yes, that would be okay. You must defer to the greater need and the collective good here. Well, she was rather shocked at that. And a vote that they had thought they had in their pocket turned out not to be, and probably because of that exchange. Ultimately, Sandra Day O'Connor wrote a very strong dissent, but it was a dissent, 5-4. The court went along with Justice John Paul Stevens, who just reiterated the old, we must defer to the supposed expertise of the local officials. So they let the condemnation go, and the homes were destroyed. And ultimately, what many people don't know is the whole plan fell through. Today, the 90 acres is just weeds and rats and junk, where there had once been nice homes. What I think this is fascinating about this is how it shows that government planning is so often, in fact, almost always, I would say, overrated. They exaggerate the supposed benefits of what they're going to accomplish, and they underestimate the costs, not only financial, but in this case, human, which didn't matter to them in the slightest, that these people who just wanted their homes were going to be kicked off their land.
Yeah, let's go back to the fundamentals, the power of eminent domain itself. That, when I read the Constitution, I understand the Constitution is a document that sets up enumerated powers of the federal government. And yet there was no power given for eminent domain. And so it's kind of interesting that eminent domain is mentioned in the Fifth Amendment, I guess, where it says that if it's taken for this, it must be for public use, and it must be for with just compensation. But that is more in the nature of a restriction on power rather than a grant of power. And so it seems to me that it was rather clear, since they certainly were not bringing into existence a federal government of inherent powers like European governments had, that the powers are limited to the enumerated powers, that the framers really looked at eminent domain as an implied power that might be necessary to carry out one of the enumerated powers. So, for example, if you were going to build a courthouse and the government had the power to establish a judicial branch of government, they would need a place to put the courthouse. Now, I would still argue that can be done through consent, but I can understand the reasoning. Okay, if you're going to establish a courthouse, if you're going to take somebody's property, that's clearly a public use, and you got to pay for it. Unlike what had happened historically in Europe, where governments just took people's property, and which totalitarian regimes still do today. So then the Fifth Amendment says, okay, it's got to be for public use, which makes sense, and it has to be with just compensation paid to the person. So how did this translate? I don't see the public use in this Kelo case. Like, there's no courthouse being built, there's no military base being built. How does that translate into upholding this taking in a Kelo case?
Great question. Over the years, the Supreme Court suddenly changed the wording of the Fifth Amendment, which says public use. But instead, it became public purpose. I forget, I think it was back in Birdman versus Parker, if not even earlier, that the powers that wanted to be allowed to take private property, not for the building of a bridge or a road or a courthouse, but rather just because they wanted it for economic redevelopment. They started using this language, public purpose. And the courts bought that. They said, okay, we think that's what an expansive reading of the Fifth Amendment could mean, that as long as the public officials think that there is a civic purpose, such as expanding the economy, then we're going to let it go. And there have been a lot of terribly revealing cases where they've done this. There was, for instance, the Poletown case in Detroit back in the early 80s, where General Motors wanted a thriving community to be bulldozed so they could build a new plant to build Cadillacs. Poletown was not blighted. There was nothing wrong with the homes and businesses located there. But the Supreme Court of Michigan, where the case ended, said, well, we think it's for a public purpose. Expanding the economy in Detroit is good enough reason to take the land of all these people and condemn it and put up something we think is better for the community, namely a Cadillac plant. As it turns out, they did it. The Cadillac plant was built. It never produced nearly the number of jobs that were supposed to be produced, but at least there was a factory there, whereas in Kelo, there's nothing. They bulldozed it for nothing. Interestingly, though, years later, the Supreme Court of Michigan reversed itself in, I think it was 2004. They said, we were wrong. This public purpose should not be good enough, merely because the officials say, we think this will be good for the economy and create some jobs. That should not be enough to justify taking people's homes from them. When you think about the mentality here, it's much like Stalin and the kulaks. Stalin famously said, well, to make an omelet, you must break some eggs. In the 1930s, he wanted collective farming, which he thought would be for the public good of the Soviet Union. And therefore, that was perfectly good enough justification to seize the land of thousands and thousands of individual owners and ship them off to Siberia so the land could be turned over to collective farms. This is a difference not in kind, but simply in degree. What we did in Kilo, what we did in Poletown is essentially the same. It's making people accept losses, depriving them of their property for the supposed public good. And officials don't know what is in the public good. The only way we find out what's in the public good is to let individuals use their own property as they think best. This is a central planning mentality that really has no place under our Constitution.
Yeah, the irony of this is that, in the 50s, you had the national security establishment invading countries like Guatemala, where you had a communist socialist president that was seizing land from United Fruit Company and transferring it to the poor, sort of working in reverse as to what was happening over here in the United States. They were taking from the poor to give to the big corporations. And they were invading countries to stop this thing.
Yeah.
And they were calling it socialism and communism and so forth. And yet over here, it seems to me like they were doing the same thing with their urban renewal and their central planning. And am I off base on that?
No, you're absolutely right. The people who are victimized in these public domain takings are almost always the little guy who the left is always saying they're so concerned about. Like Suzette Kilo, she was a retired nurse who had bought and fixed up this house and just wanted to enjoy it. But she was told, no, you're not allowed to do that. We need to improve the economy of New London, and you're staying in your house gets in the way of that. So this is exactly the same thing, but it's okay when it's done by big corporations and powerful politicians in the United States. This has happened over and over again, and sometimes, at least, we succeed in fending it off. There was another fascinating case I read about a few years ago down in Texas, close to your own home, I think. It was down near the Brazos River in Freeport. There was a big public idea, and there was one big developer who was behind this public idea, that he wanted a marina on property that was owned by a bunch of little guys who were, they did some shrimping, and it wasn't big business, it was small business. But somebody came up with this idea for a big, public, beautiful, luxury marina and hotel and residences and shopping, and they wanted this land. Well, they were able to defeat it. And I don't think Institute for Justice fought this case, by the way. Of course, that doesn't really matter. But they're able to defeat it. Astoundingly, a few years later, a woman wrote a book about the case. It was entitled Bulldozed. The author's name is Carla Main. And for having written the book, the bigwig who was defeated in his attempt to use eminent domain to get his hands on all this private property, sued her for defamation of character, for telling the truth about, and it gets worse. Among the people who wrote a blurb for the book was the preeminent constitutional scholar Richard Epstein. They also sued him for having put a favorable blurb on a book that told the truth about this guy's ugly efforts at using strong-arm tactics to take away private property. And this plan probably wouldn't have worked anyway, but that's really beside the point. These are people who think that because they're well-connected and have friends in high places and are rich, they can use the power of the government to further enrich themselves at the expense of little guys. It happens all the time in the United States.
Yeah, that's the shocking thing to me here is that, of course, the whole welfare state is based on the government taking money from one group of people and giving it to another group of people. So they've sort of inculcated this mindset into the American people that there's nothing immoral about the government doing that. And, of course, as libertarians, we see the fundamental immorality of taking money that doesn't belong to you and giving it to someone else. But here they're using the eminent domain power to enrich a private corporation that says, I want your property. And the person, we all grow up with under the adage, man's home is his castle, which means that nobody can touch you there and the government can't touch you. And yet now you have this Kelo case saying if a big corporation wants your property and makes you an offer and you say, no, I want to stay in my home, I don't want to sell to you, that they can run to the city council, maybe put a little bit of cash into the back pockets of those city councilmen and say, here, take that person's property away from him, give him what it's worth, send him on its way, and let me have it. That, to me, is an absolutely shocking notion that violates the principles of private property on which this country was founded.
Oh, it does. And this is done both by liberal Democrats who always say, oh, we're so concerned about the little guy, and Republicans who say, oh, we're so concerned about property rights and free enterprise. They're both complicit in this. When the Democrats say, oh, we're concerned about the little guy, someone should say, well, why is it then that all your friendly politicians in New London, for instance, were quite content to bulldoze the homes of a bunch of little guys who just wanted to remain peacefully in their homes? And Republicans are just as bad. They talk a nice game about private property and free enterprise, but then when it comes to eminent domain, they go AWOL. They don't want to fight for the principles of protecting individual liberty and property.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting. You mentioned the term central planning. And most of us libertarians are familiar with the term, but we all know that term in the context of the Soviet Union. It was part of what brought the Soviet Union down. It's concepts of government agencies planning in a top-down command and control fashion economic activity, as compared to what we libertarians advocate, and that is get government out of interfering with economic activity and let the spontaneous order generate, what is going to bring into existence. And that the spontaneous order is people voluntarily interacting with each other, including selling your property or not selling your property. But, when you look at this concept of central planning, it really shows that this socialist ideal was taking over everywhere, and including at the local level. And as you pointed out, the Kelo case turned out to be a disaster. But when you look at any of these ideas of central planning, urban renewal, and all the rest of them, I think it's extremely difficult to find any success stories, which to me shouldn't surprise anybody, since this is what really brought about the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Yeah, and this is one of the things I really liked about Soman's book, was he got into the political economy of eminent domain takings. And he made the point that they're always based on this idea that politicians and local government experts can figure out how to use land better than the people who are actually living there. Well, almost invariably what happens is these people who don't stand to bear the costs of being wrong It's no skin off their nose if their plans have wildly exaggerated what they think will be the benefits and greatly underestimated the costs. It's no skin off their nose if this thing fails. Now, that's the great thing about the free market, is if you want to buy land and organize resources for some purpose that you think will be profitable, you're not going to do it unless you've carefully evaluated the costs and benefits. And, of course, part of the cost is paying people what they're willing to take in return for their land or other goods that you want. So this central planning notion that was at work in New London and so many other places encouraged this mistaken idea that the few who are not even playing with their own money can figure out how to change the resource use in the city. And it almost always works out badly. And even if it worked out well, it still, I think, is not justified in making a few people worse off just so a few others can have better paying jobs.
Yeah, and you know, an argument might be made by the statists that, oh, well, the person's getting paid for it, no big deal. He or she can go out and buy another house with the money. But that argument to me doesn't make any sense because, let's face it, value is subjective. I mean, everybody knows that. So it's really difficult to come up with an objective value for a home. If a person doesn't want to sell, that means that no amount of money will satisfy him, that his home he values more. And I've seen these pictures of where giant hotels sometimes are built up around somebody's little shack because they refuse to sell. And that, to me, is what that embodies Americanism, that, hey, that's what private property is all about. And if that hotel can't make an offer that's attractive to that homeowner, well, then you just build a hotel around it or you don't build a hotel at all. But that, to me, is really what the sanctity of private property is all about. And I remember one of the greatest books I ever read was that biography of Robert Moses by Robert Caro. And there's story after story about where Moses just destroyed entire neighborhoods, which, as you point out, the public official would call blight, but where these are really intricate relationships that are taking place within a city, where you got poor people that are really, really developing an intricate system of interrelationships.
Yeah, that was the point Jane Jacobs made in her excellent book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities. And she was an opponent. This was written in 1961, but she had seen this urban renewal planning mentality taking place, and she saw what it was doing to ordinary little people who own small businesses and little apartment buildings, tearing their communities apart. They were working communities, but the know-it-alls in Washington or the state capitol or the local planning council said, oh, we have better ideas of what should be done with this land. So they would tear it apart, they would bulldoze it, the people would be scattered, and almost always these people would wind up much worse off and very unhappy. Merely paying them something is not nearly good enough. The people in Kilo, and this is another of the good parts about this book, is you really got to understand these people, and you really feel for them. They didn't want to have their homes bulldozed. They didn't want to have to move. They liked where they were. They felt comfortable where they were. Many of these people were rather elderly. And to throw them out was bordering on criminal. It shouldn't happen in a free country, which, of course, we are not much of any longer.
Well, yeah, and you point out in your article, and you mentioned today, the ultimate outcome of all this. You destroy these people's homes, you force them out, you destroy their homes for the sake of this big corporation and this central planning project, and then, lo and behold, not surprising to us libertarians, the whole thing turns out to be a disaster. I mean, it's like a walking advertisement for this abuse of eminent domain and for central planning itself, that you now got this area where weeds are growing up. I mean, that's real blight to me. And whatever happened to the people they threw out of their homes, well, who knows? But if they had just left them alone, they'd still have nice homes there. and that corporation maybe would have built anyway, because as you pointed out, they didn't need the homes anyway. They just didn't want them around. But it really is like a walking advertisement for the whole disaster of central planning and eminent domain abuse, it seems to me.
Oh, that's exactly right. Without the power to force these people out, they would have had to have negotiated and accommodated the people who said, look, my property is more important to me than whatever money you're prepared to give me. Well, the plan could have still gone ahead, and it would have meant the horror of having ugly and dumb old homes within sight of this beautiful new development. But so what? That's part of freedom. You have to accept other people's property rights, and instead of running roughshod over them, which is exactly what New London did.
On that note, we have to sign off. We're out of time. George, it's great to have you on the show. For those of you that are not familiar with George's work, he writes an absolutely fantastic column at Forbes, and you can check out his articles at the John W. Pope Center for Higher Education Policy in North Carolina. Just Google the Pope Center and George Leaf. And George, thanks for coming on the show. It's great to have you.
My pleasure, Bumper. Great pleasure.
All right. Until next week, this is Jacob Hornberger signing off. We'll see you next week. Bye-bye.